my experience with education is incredibly broad. So I think I've done pretty much every kind. I've been to public school, I have been to private school, I have been homeschooled with a curriculum, I have been radically unschooled without a curriculum, and I have some university education after expenses got to the point where I decided to leave. So that is my experience with schooling.
Hello and welcome. I'm Zylla, and this is my Athenaeum. Today we'll be dissecting yet another problem with the public education system in the US. The pay-for-play nature of various types of school. This is part 3 in my series, The Ivory Tower. If you'd like to start at the beginning, you can click the card above or the link in the doobly-doo below. When we talk about the idea of hierarchies in schools, we also have to talk about the idea of the hierarchy of schools. And I don't just mean which neighborhoods get more funding, although that's certainly part of it, but also the various types of privatization of education versus public schools. Cash rules everything around us. All a government really is a redistribution of collective resources. And under capitalism, that means money. We pay taxes to the government, and the government uses that money to build public services, like education. Well, okay, the government we have now mostly redistributes that money into their own pockets after laundering it through the military, but that's a topic for another time. Anyway, this is how we get public education funding in the US. Sort of. See, you remember that thing where until like a century after the US was founded, we didn't even have a National Department of Education, and then it didn't even really start to like centralize until the 1980s? Yeah, see, we're only really about 40 years into the national funding for education mattering even a little bit, which means that even now, a lot of the way that public education is funded is through state or even local governments. Which means it matters a lot where you are. According to a study by the Urban Institute in 2017, most public education funding that came from the federal government was spent progressively. That is, moving us towards equity in terms of access to education. But most of the public spending from state and local governments was spent actively regressively. In many school districts, school spending is determined by property taxes, which means the wealthier your local neighborhood is, the better funded your public school is. And money matters, because we're not just talking the difference between, a decent public school and a public school with all the frills and fripperies. We're talking the kind of funding that you need to have enough teachers, a building maintained such that the windows aren't broken, and sewage isn't coming up in the courtyard. And yes, in case you were wondering, those last two are from personal experience. But we'll get to that.
And were you in public
Allegedly
schools or?
public schools and predominantly high needs at risk schools is the code word they usually use for poor Black schools.
So why isn't that more equitable federal funding going further? Well, it turns out that that's only about 8% of the school budget. The rest is split roughly evenly between state and local governments. And even though that federal spending, being progressive, is spent largely on poorer schools, the state funding tends to be distributed evenly regardless of need, and the local funding, like I said, the money stays where the wealthy people already are. At that point, under this system, the tilt towards regression, a death spiral where poor schools get poor funding and produce poor results, is inevitable. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, even though the revenue of the average public school has gone up in the last decade and change, the amount spent by the federal government has gone down by about 30%, from a high of $96 billion in 2010 to a low of $64 billion in 2017. If you pay much attention to national politics in the US, you might have some alarm bells going off right now, and right you are, dear viewer. That 2010 height, well, that was just after President Obama's American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and 2017 is shortly after Trump took office. We return now to a discussion of what education is for on an ideological level, but not in a favorable sense. We now have to examine what politicians and their partisans think education is really for. In the introduction, I spoke about Henry Ford and his drive to make education produce the ideal workforce, and the ways that that has shaped the goals of our public education since.
I mean, what don't you unlearn from elementary school when you think about it, right? Like the only actual social skills I think we should all keep from elementary school is sharing is caring and that nap time is important. Almost everything you end up learning in, like, especially the public school system, is something you end up needing to unlearn if you want to be a healthy individual outside of school, because you learn a lot about how the current world works, right? You learn that there are hierarchies, and you learn that there's groups, and you learn that, like, both from teachers directly and from your other students implicitly, that whoever has the more perceived authority is the person who actually makes the rules.
But so for most of us, we have this idea, we have to get a job. How do we get a job? We get a college degree or an associate's degree or what have you. And how do we do that? We have to get grades in high school, and we need, these high school classes to prepare us for college. And that's why, if you don't do well in school, parents or teachers will tell you that you're going to work at McDonald's for the rest of your life, because grades lead to future career. And so if you don't have good grades, you will have, this job that is universally looked down on. And so that's incredibly harmful, because it takes away all of that like kind of intrinsic value of education, where we see education as like a tool that we use rather than as something valuable in itself. It's like, I'm only getting this degree because I know it will get me this job, not because I genuinely actually care about learning about this thing.
But that's honestly the better end of what politicians want when it comes to public schooling. Politicians with a little bit less of a moral compass tend to see public education as the enemy. An educated population is just as dangerous as an armed one, if not more so, because educated people have more opportunities to realize that there's nothing about the people in power that makes them any better than anyone else. This is not a uniquely modern or American take. The elites of many a culture from across time and space have come up with the grand idea that you can oppress people by denying them information and skills. As the Holocaust historian Rachel von Bockum once put it, destruction of physical or intangible artifacts that embody ideas, beliefs, and characteristics of past societies is a well-tested means of control and power. The ancient Chinese religion of Taoism, while appealing to many now as a path to meditative peace in a chaotic world, was in context a fabrication of the elites to keep the peasants from wondering about their activities. The ancient Romans routinely destroyed public education centers when they came across them, like the Jewish temples in Judea, and also made a point of mocking and deriding the Greek culture of public education, even while using those Greeks taken as slaves to educate their own. The Daesh and the Taliban routinely destroy false idols, historical artifacts, whenever they find them. So it should come as no surprise that some of the American elite want to destroy public education and critical thinking. Those things give us a chance to fight off their stranglehold on power.
So I think that's really harmful. And, obviously it starts in our public schools because, you constantly hear how they're getting rid of like art classes and music classes. And like my high school that I went to, the year after I graduated, well, so I was in band for 2 years. I played the trumpet. And then I quit so that I could take more AP classes instead of having to take a band class. Because again, I wanted to be valedictorian and those AP classes have a higher GPA boost. Anyway, the band, the year after I graduated, actually ended their like marching band thing. Like they stopped doing shows during halftime of the football games because it was too like expensive to get the like rights to, the music and the formations and stuff. And so they stopped doing it. And they would just stand out in the middle of the field and play whatever music instead of actually doing the like cool stuff that it was enjoyable to both be in the marching band and to watch. And that's because, the school didn't have the funds, even though they had just revamped the football field.
Let's take the example of Betsy DeVos. You may remember her as Trump's Secretary of Education. For those who don't know, Trump routinely placed people in charge of things that they had sworn to destroy. An oil baron in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency. A man who, in his own words, set out to destroy the state as his chief strategist. And, for Secretary of Education, a woman who wants to end it. In a speech she gave in 2015, mere months before her elevation to head of education in the United States, Betsy DeVos said,
"We are the beneficiaries of startups, ventures, and innovation in every other area of life, but we don't have that in education because it's a closed system, a closed industry, a closed market. It's a monopoly, a dead end."
If that's pinging your capitalism radar, well, good for you. That is, of course, DeVos's origin and foundation for her political takes. She comes from the wealthy Prince family. Her father made his fortune in auto manufacturing and used some of that wealth to found the Family Research Council, an organization classified as a hate group against LGBTQ people by the Suffolk Poverty Law Center. DeVos's brother, Eric Prince, used that wealth to found the Christo-fascist mercenary company Blackwater, primarily known for war crimes against the Iraqi people. But it's who she married that's the real kicker here. The DeVos family is the controlling force behind Amway, the biggest multi-level marketing company in the world, beating out their nearest competitor by about $2 billion. Rich DeVos was Edgar Prince's collaborator in founding the Family Research Council. He was also the Reagan pick for leader of the Republican National Convention, at least until he was ousted for being too publicly happy about a recession. His son Dick, for those of you who are having trouble keeping track of which old white conservative man is which, that's Betsy's husband, is heir to the MLM fortune and also the huckster, their word, way of life. Of public education, Dick once said,
"The church has been replaced by the public school."
Also, Betsy DeVos once proudly wrote of the DeVos family as the largest single contributor of soft money to the Republican Party. So here we have a woman at the center of a Christo-fascist capitalist empire. A link combining these two Republican dark money families and all of their lobbyists, sitting squarely between privatized military and corporate swindling. By the way, the difference between a pyramid scheme and a multi-level marketing company is that the MLM has a product to sell, but that doesn't mean that the money comes from selling the product. In fact, it comes from recruitment, getting new people to join. All of that money still flows uphill. But more to the point, Betsy DeVos took all of these threads of power and set out to do one thing above all others: dismantle public education. She started in Michigan, where the Princes and the DeVosses both live, and the Washington Post once named her a shining light to members of the movement to privatize education. It's possible you've heard her pitch before. It's not about privatization, it's about choice. After all, with public schools, you have to go where you're zoned. But with charter schools and vouchers for private schools, you get to choose where your child goes. So now we need to talk about what charter schools are and what they aren't.
We have charter schools as an alternate to public schools. They are still funded largely, it can depend on the state, but are still largely funded with public monies, whether that is from the individual town that hosts the charter school or the state or the federal government. They are also eligible for a number of nonprofit grants that they can get in line with as well. And charter schools differ from a public school system in a couple different ways. One of the key components, and the reason it's called a charter school, is that the school enters into charter with the State Board of Education. And so they can be less location-based.
So it's kind of halfway between a public and a private school in terms of regulations and funding.
Yeah, I would say that that's a good way to put it. And certainly state legislatures can have a big piece of that. Some states are much more friendly to charters and will provide things like not vouchers, because that tends to be a little bit more about private schools. But can provide additional funding to really encourage the growth of charter schools. The trade-off is sometimes more oversight, but not always.
Yeah, it sounds like it has the public funding, but not the public oversight.
Right. Charter schools offer a bit of a workaround around that, so that if you are in a state like Connecticut, where there are big racial disparities in terms of housing town by town, it offers a way to say, hey, we've created this school with this special mission, and you don't need to be part of our city in order to still attend it, which in theory can reduce some of the racial inequities in education.
I noticed you said in theory there.
I did say in theory. One of the challenges that I really think about first with those inequities is I think about special education and how that plays into charter schools. Because those students are coming from a home district, that home district is in charge of their special education funding. And so sometimes parents with the best of intents want their student to be at a smaller school, at a more supportive school, because of their social or intellectual needs, and then finds that their home district is refusing to provide the services for special education that they would have legally been required to provide had they been in their home district. They still have to provide those services, but there are a lot more bureaucratic hoops that allow disingenuous public schools looking to save a buck to really drag their feet.
A charter school is a school funded like a public school, but run start to finish by a private group. This, supporters will tell you, is a breeding ground for innovation. Instead of just being stuck with your geographical cohort, you could find a charter school that's dedicated to environmentalism or civic ideas or any kind of brand new organizing factor. What a wonderful opportunity for school choice. But you don't generally get to choose very much when it comes to charter schools. As with many private schools, enrollment is so limited that it comes down to a lottery. And sure, you can enter your child in that lottery, but the odds of them getting in, well, it's more chance than choice. So you don't know where your child is going to end up until fairly late. And let's say you do get into the charter school of choice. What are you going to find there? In the best case scenario, you will find an able group of educators and administrators, everything a school needs to run. But that's the best case. Does that really happen every time?
So I will say that in some ways, at least at first, it really did feel like, as I was teaching at this charter, it was really walking that walk as well. So I was glad to see that my initial research kind of matched up with expectations. Because it wasn't dealing with a larger school district, because it, was dealing with grant funders and things like that, it definitely meant that there were different kinds of oversight than I expected. But a lot of those ended up being much more, I would say, almost public relations fronted than they were actually about creating any change. I also found that the pressures of the state, since it wasn't being filtered down through a school district, like a larger school district, the pressures of the state often put it in direct conflict with the equity that was being promised to teachers and families.
Oh, how's that?
States are still going to be asking about standardized test scores, for example. And while we certainly could say, hey, when students take this ongoing standardized test, because every public school and charter school has to deal with those in some capacity, we could show that students academically were growing, that we were closing the quote unquote achievement gap by having those students there. But if a student was being sent to us that had frankly been done a disservice by their home district, and as ninth graders were coming in with a third grade reading level, it was impossible for us by the time they were in 11th grade, or at least it was extremely difficult for us to get them to take the state standardized test, which for Connecticut is the SATs.
It's all too easy for even a group of people with the best of intentions to fail to create a viable plan for school. There are plenty of people that come up with grand ideas, but can't figure out the execution. Logistics is an undervalued and fairly rare skill. Once you have it together, the work doesn't just stop. You have to keep finding all of the new teachers you need. You need to keep on every semester enrolling and engaging your new students and graduating them. And you keep having to account for your educational practices to the authorities. You have to keep the project running at top speed. It's really easy for that to go wrong somewhere, especially in a teacher shortage.
One of the nice things, right, I'm always going to rah-rah for unions. Public schools are unionized. That means that you get a clear contract that outlines your roles and responsibilities as an educator, for good or ill. That might have meant that I could not have hung up a painting in my classroom because that was something that maintenance needed to do for safety reasons or for purposeful reasons. But it meant that I had a pretty clear understanding of what I needed to do on a day-to-day basis to be doing my job contractually. Charter schools, because of their existence within the nonprofit industrial complex, often do rely on a scarcity model or a perceived scarcity model where you're really doing whatever job is needed because that's what we need to get things done for the children. because there's also that lack of organized labor, it's pretty easy for charter schools to play favorites. I've certainly heard some horror stories about teachers in that way that you mentioned, that charters were halfway between public and private schools, in the way that private charter school teachers who maybe were on the ins with administration would be protected if there weren't great things going on. But conversely could be shoved out for pretty much any reason.
And that's assuming positive intent. There's no guarantee that a private individual or organization actually has such a thing. There have definitely been cases where someone has defrauded the government by proposing a plan for a charter school and then just running off with the money.
Not that school in specific, but a number of other schools within the state I teach that have already run afoul when audits have been done to find out that money wasn't being spent in the ways that it was described. Such that local school districts may end up taking control of that charter school and turning it into a magnet school instead, or completely shutting it down from top to bottom.
There have been charter schools so flawed, they don't make it through the school year.
An Orange County charter school suddenly closed its doors without notice.
In Philadelphia alone, at least 10 executives have pled guilty in the last decade to charges like fraud.
This charter school suddenly closed its doors in the middle of the day.
So what happens to a kid enrolled in a school that never opens? Or that goes under mid-year? Or that simply does a bad job? In most places, the oversight on charter schools simply isn't good enough to prevent these things. Charter schools should not exist. I'm not saying that there aren't any good ones. There are, and I don't want to deny you that experience if you've had it. But I think the good ones should just become part of the public school system. And the goodwill that they've built up, instead of being used to create more questionable charter schools, should go towards fixing the public schools we already have, making them a better option instead of these under-supervised and potentially fraudulent exceptions. So when Betsy DeVos goes on about school choice, you have to remember that what she's actually done in her home state of Michigan is take a functioning public education system, a decent one, and stretch it so thin that the public schools have no funding and the charter schools have no backbone. This is what the Washington Post meant when they said that she wanted to privatize education. She's destroying public education by franchising it out. So then, what of the children of these wealthy elites out to destroy public education? Surely they don't want their own heirs to be uneducated. Then who would be left to rule the peasants?
I think that in this country, at least, we have this idea that schools are for jobs. One of my sources, Herb Childress, he talks about how that's not always entirely true. We have... That idea is true for most of us. But if we look at the elite schools, and if we look at the Ivy Leagues, and we look at these, the top tier private liberal arts colleges, those schools are not preparing their students to do jobs. Those schools are preparing their students to be players on the world stage. Or as he puts it, teaching their students how to rule the world.
Well, that's where private school comes in. While public education and charter schools are funded by public money, private schools charge tuition and can get money from other organizations supporting their cause. They can afford to hire the best of the best. Let's face it, public school teachers' pay is dreadful. And charter schools often pay even less. Whereas many a private school teacher can afford to live comfortably. in a teacher shortage, that's where the ones who can get hired go.
So just to kind of reflect and summarize.
Of course.
I'm hearing that your average public school teacher is putting in tons of their own money and maybe getting reimbursed for part of it from the government later. And putting in at least 20, if not 40 more hours than the work week. And they're responsible not only for the students learning in their own classroom, but for emotional and physical well-being and safety. And then on top of that, they're asked to be part of the administrative staff and to keep up with all of the changes and training.
Yeah, I mean, that's it in a nutshell.
And this pays what?
What it pays me or what it pays. I know within this state, Connecticut is considered a higher spot for teacher pay. And it varies widely because Connecticut everything's done at the town level. So there are some towns in Connecticut for a first year teacher that might be paying $27,000. And for a first year teacher might be paying $46,000.
Oh my God.
I have 10 years of experience and a master's degree, and I'm at a particularly well-paying school, like a school that's got both a strong union and it received a lot of additional funding because it's an urban school to get teachers to come work for it. And I make $80,000 after a decade of experience and degrees.
I'm not saying that all private schools are good. Certainly they're not. But if you really want school choice, you have to have money.
Yeah, so I went to a magnet school for middle and high school. They were a school for the arts, and I had to test into them, but they were cool because, they're still public schools, so my parents didn't have to pay for them. Because if I hadn't gotten into those schools, my parents very much assured me three things would happen. Either I would be sent to Africa, I would be sent to Nigeria. We'd have to spend their entire paycheck on private school because we could not go to the zoned middle school and high school that I had. Or honestly, I might get homeschooled. So that was kind of like what was on the table.
So why couldn't you go to the zoned one, if you don't mind my asking?
Like I said, we lived in a very predominantly Black neighborhood, and our property values reflected that. And that also then went to how our school system was in the area. It wasn't seen as the best set of schools that were around during the time that I was like when I was young. So they weren't, you weren't, if you wanted your kid to get out of the city, they probably didn't go to the zone school, is the myth that I was told, yeah.
A private school has all the potential pitfalls of a charter school without any of the public risk. The investors and enrollees in a private school have pretty direct access to how the school is run, and there's always the possibility that funders and enrollees will simply take their business elsewhere. So as long as the parents and the institutions that fund a private school believe in what it's doing, it can run forever. Whereas if it's not responsive, it will simply lose both money and students until it ceases to exist. I'm not sure that's a good thing, but at least it's not taking taxpayer money and impoverished children's dreams and running off with them. I grew up going to private school. I started off in a Montessori elementary school where I had 3 to at most 15 kids in my class. And then I went to a private Jewish middle school. I applied to a handful of different private high schools, but I ended up going to a magnet program in a public school for high school. It still wasn't the school I was zoned for. I never once attended the baseline school setting for somebody in my neighborhood. I didn't have to. We had the money for better. Meanwhile, there are mothers getting jail time for falsifying their home address to be one block over so that their child can go to a better school. Private schools are deeply unfair. They have an inherent bias towards the wealthy, even if they accept vouchers and have scholarships for poorer students, because they're answerable to their paying customers. You don't have to be rich to homeschool your child, but you do have to have a lot of time, which under our current system means either being rich or being willing to make some pretty hard compromises. You, or a designated instructor, have to do all of the work of a teacher with your child or children, but without the backing of a school environment. You have to find non-school ways for them to socialize, and you have to jump through all of the same hoops that any educational organization would have to do, including testing and paperwork. Even more than private schools, homeschooling can be tailored to an individual child's needs. It's all about parental oversight, and that can be an incredible thing. Or a terrible one.
So my mom took me out for grade 3. In about halfway through grade 4, I was like, I still had my friends and stuff. So I was like, oh, I want to go back to school. Went back to school for half of grade 4, grade 5, and grade 6. And then I was like, actually, no, I do hate this. This is miserable. This is crushing my soul. So I went back out of school until grade 10. And that's when kind of the unschooling thing happened. Grade 10, I tried public high school, hated it with a fiery passion. She was a full-time mom, which is obviously, part of why we were able to do that in the first place. We were very lucky in that regard. And so I was sort of, in a way, the guinea pig for her breaking away from this, because she saw how miserable I was and was like, okay, well, why don't we try homeschooling? Why don't we try, following a curriculum at home? And both of us were miserable because we were still glued to this curriculum. So from there, it sort of evolved into, why don't I just give you tools to learn and create a space that encourages learning, and you can pursue what you would like to pursue. So that was sort of the environment that I grew up in. And there was always the option, like if we ever wanted to go back to school, we were welcome to do that. But there was never any pressure one way or the other. And there was a lot of encouragement to just kind of pursue an independent education based on our interests.
One big thing is, I think, like, for the most part, like, if you're spending time with your kids, like, they're probably learning a lot. Like, I think it's hard, and even now I still struggle with it. It's hard not to think of learning in the structure of school. And so it can feel like, oh, the thing I'm doing isn't really teaching. And I think that's not good. Like, I think there's a lot of things when they're left on the devices and you're supporting them, their projects, like, okay, our kid, he does lots of stuff. Like, that was just, there are certain areas that he probably won't get into naturally on his own, that I definitely want to kind of make sure, like, hey, there's certain things we should talk about a little bit. It's good to have a basic knowledge in some areas, but like, there's tons of stuff that he's mostly picked up on his own.
Homeschooling can mean that a child who learns differently for whatever reason is able to experience the joy of learning for themselves. But it can also mean a strict and controlled environment in which the child is unable to learn about or really process the larger world around them. Both private schools and homeschooling, and to some extent charter schools because they're functionally privatized, have a problem. A plague of religious zealotry.
I do remember that it was very, white supremacist, Christian imperialist, and not explicitly, but just in the standard, it's the early 90s and you live in a colonial country, and so here's what education looks like. It was that.
Again, hashtag not all religions. I'm not saying that all religiously oriented schools are bad. In fact, many religious institutions have been a strong foundation for educational tradition. Just look at the madrasas of Islam or the Jesuit tradition in Christianity. Heck, modern institutions, the private middle school that I went to was Jewish, although I grant I particularly perceived the Jewish angle as a price I was paying for quality education.
Texas really only has public and private. Within the private school sphere, there is also a great deal of religious schools. And that definitely also contributed to my misery. I was Jewish. I did attend one private school that was a Jewish school attached to a synagogue, but that was only for about a year. And I became very uncomfortable there because these children had been together since preschool Montessori. They were very cliquish.
But there is a subset of private education in the US that is extremely fundamentalist, and it's almost always some flavor of Christian. I've known more than one person who went to some kind of sectarian private school, Catholic, Protestant, whatever, not because it was a good school, because it wasn't, but because their parents wanted to control who they made social connections with. And for many people, I'm sure that the first thing you thought when I mentioned homeschooling was the particular flavor that is very Christian fundamentalist. It's one of the most common reasons that parents pull their children out of the public education system for homeschooling. It's to teach these anti-science and anti-diversity pieces of hogwash without any pushback. If you keep it all inside the community, how is the kid ever going to know that it's wrong?
Our courses are carefully designed to provide the highest quality education possible. For us, that means 4 things.
The first is building all of our educational principles on the strong foundation of the truth of God's Word.
Not to mention that this style of homeschooling has this old-fashioned gender roles appeal to it. It really slides right into that submissive, nurturing woman thing. Oh, she just couldn't bear to be parted from her sweet children, someone else looking after them all day when she could be spending time with them. And never mind whatever other plans she might have had for her life. In a public school setting, where the legal tradition is to keep religion out of the classrooms unless it's being explicitly studied, the students are whoever happens to live nearby, and that means a diversity of viewpoints. That's dangerous to a fundamentalist way of life and their rigid control over information.
I was homeschooled for 9 years, 3rd through 5th grade, and again in 7th through 12th. The purpose of this was to keep me isolated from the world.
We see with fundy culture a lot of times, the more she started ramping up in connections, what does she start to do? She pulls the kids out of school and starts to homeschool.
Yep. And this is what we were talking about. The fundamentalist abuse, there's a lot of overlap, and I think that's a good place to highlight the paranoia, the staunch belief that the rest of the world is, as it turns from the rest of the world is not like you to the rest of the world is against you.
So it's incredibly important that public education be well-funded and rigorous, held to the highest of standards, and flexible enough to accommodate a wide array of students and learning styles. Which is not what we have right now. Between active defunding by the wealthy and powerful and the mirage of charter schools, there are a lot of public schools that are just not getting enough money to be viable. Homeschooling and private school become kind of the only options left if you don't want your child to be left behind. But the standards that schools are being held to, both public and private, are just not doing any good. Why is that? Join me in part 4 to find out more. And in the meantime, Keep learning, friends.